Good morning, good afternoon to all. President Grimson, thank you. I thank you. I thank our hosts at the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources, the Polar Research Institute of China. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. President, as you mentioned, I started my week out in Finland. I think it's fair to say that the air is clear there. The water is nice and cool. Perhaps the political climate was a little bit warmer than you usually see at the Arctic Council Ministerial, but it was important. It is important for me to be here. President Grimson asked at the outset of the plenary just a bit ago, why the Arctic discussion here in China? And when he invited me, I said, why should I come? Why should I come to China, of all places? I come from an Arctic country. I come from an Arctic state. Why should I come to China? But I think the answer to that is just exactly as he said, that the future of the Arctic today is being determined by so many who are not part of the Arctic. And so it is imperative for those of us who call the Arctic home to be engaged in these discussions with those outside the Arctic, to understand their interests, to really engage in a level of cooperation and collaboration. These are so many of the buzzwords, if you will, that you think of when you think about the Arctic. You hear cooperation, you hear collaboration, you hear the term, the Arctic is a zone of peace. These are all true today. We certainly hope they will remain synonymous with the Arctic well into the future. But there is another word that we are hearing more and more in conjunction with the Arctic, and that is the word change. Change. Today's Arctic is not the Arctic of generations past. I think we know that. Our place on the globe hasn't changed. You look at the globe, you look at the map, we're still up there. But the world around us has changed, no longer confined by ice year-round. We are seeing greater activity outside of our front door. And some of it's welcome, and some of it is very threatening. Climate change has brought a level of unpredictability and uncertainty that has challenged the understanding of traditional knowledge that has existed for generations. A very simple example of this, it's a matter of life and death, truly, to know and understand the ice around you. If you are a native person who is a hunter, who is traveling in the area in the winter months, if you don't know and understand and have the ability to read the ice, things happen. We've had more deaths this spring season of snow machines going through the ice because we're seeing levels of thaw that are unexpected and unpredictable. With diminished sea ice, we see greater accessibility to the region and to its resources, along with increased international awareness, and the far north has been flooded with investment activity and competing interests. So Alaska, like so many Arctic areas, is very rich with resources. That's what we're known for. We're known for our oil, for our gas, for our minerals. And over the years, the history of my state, of my home in Alaska, has been one of access to resources, whether it is coal, oil, gold, furs, timber. There has been a level of harvest and extraction that has certainly benefited others. But the indigenous peoples, the peoples who have been there for thousands of years, have often asked the question, how have we seen that benefit? How have we gained? Oftentimes the promise of jobs is just that. It is a promise, but not necessarily materialized. But we are seeing investments in the Arctic that we would say are good, are necessary, are important, are helpful to bringing the people of the North into this century. In recent years, we've seen fiber optic cable and satellite coverage that are bringing global connectivity to small, remote, and very isolated communities. But at the same time, they're affecting the culture and the values of the indigenous populations there. We're seeing cruise ships with thousands of passengers. It's great for tourism, but they're pulling into our small coastal communities, which will boost their economies, but they also dwarf the local population and impact their infrastructure there. And of course, national security interests are more often at the forefront of today's discussions about the High North. So as President Grimson mentioned, it was earlier this week, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in his speech that the region has become an arena for power and competition, and the 8 Arctic states must adapt to this new future. He was direct. He was very blunt in much of his message, and he certainly had a very blunt message about Chinese investment in the region. I would imagine that some of his comments, these pretty hard truths, probably didn't sit too well in a room like this. But with regards to the overall message about investment guidelines in the Arctic, I think we need to recognize that much of what he said was not necessarily news. There are rules of engagement that we play by, whether it's in the Arctic or around the world, rules regarding respect and transparency. The Secretary stated that U.S. and Arctic nations welcome transparent Chinese investment that reflects economic interest and national security ambitions. The World Economic Forum put out its Arctic Investment Protocol in December of 2015, and it sets forth principles for sustainable development within the region. The indigenous permanent participants to the Arctic Council sought to establish the Algu Fund to help the participants not only engage with the Arctic Council and their partners on their projects, but they were really and continue to seek to bring greater local voice and control to Arctic Council activities. So we really have a need to blend the national security interests of today's Arctic with those words that have historically been associated with the Arctic: cooperation, collaboration, but also incorporating local and traditional knowledge and ensuring that the investments in the region are sustainable and that they benefit the local population. I share some words from a friend of mine and a friend of probably many in this room, a gentleman who's been very involved in Arctic issues, Meade Treadwell from my state. And Meade just said yesterday in testimony in Washington, D.C., he said the challenge in the Arctic is to unlock its values while maintaining our values, those values of the traditional way of life, food security, our natural environment, but also respect for rules of law when it comes to maritime boundaries, freedom of navigation. So respecting or unlocking the values while maintaining our values. So really, how do we go about doing this? I think sometimes the best way to move this needle is for those who have a permanent presence in the Arctic to set that example. And the reality is that Arctic nations with indigenous populations have a built-in advantage because our policymakers, people like me, have to answer to those who live in the region who are directly impacted by Arctic investment and Arctic activity. And one of the most effective strategies is to invest in the people. We spend so much time, and it's appropriate. It's appropriate that we focus on the physical aspects of the Arctic, whether it's the infrastructure needs, whether it's what we're seeing with ice conditions or thawing permafrost. But the fact of the matter is that for investment to be sustainable, the local populations need to have the capacity to maintain and support the physical infrastructure. And we need to ensure that those who will take the biggest risks in any economic activity, because the biggest risks are really on those who will continue to be there years and decades and perhaps centuries after a project has come and gone. Those who take the biggest risk in any economic activities see the direct benefits that make that risk worthwhile. So capacity building is really the win-win-win for the people, the governments, and the businesses alike. And there are challenges with this, we certainly know that. Human capacity development has to be rooted and relevant to the people that are living in the Arctic with respect for their culture, respect for their language. There needs to be a link between the economic opportunities and the education system itself. In many of the communities that we have in Alaska, our remote Arctic communities, the competition for higher learning is not necessarily between colleges that might be vying for a student, but really whether or not an individual decides to pursue additional education at all. And it's not just whether or not it's a college, it is community training, it's vocational, it's another instrument of learning. But we also have to recognize that so many continue to live a subsistence lifestyle. So moving to a city is not considered to be an option for them for additional education or training. So how we deliver that education by way of the internet has to be considered as a reality. And next is the reality that infrastructure capacity varies amongst the Arctic nations, from the most developed Nordic region to the North American Arctic, which I include Greenland, that really have limited infrastructure. And limited infrastructure is an immediate challenge, but it can also be viewed as an opportunity because it provides an opportunity to plan and build in a more holistic manner, but also a much more resilient manner that is forward-thinking, that can use not only the indigenous and the local knowledge, but truly utilizing the local population and the investor to determine what that best need going forward is. In Alaska, so much of what came with our state's development came with the military that had one view, one perspective, but it was not necessarily in sync with the needs of the local population and the communities. The military often is the first mover. As they've got the assets, they have the mission to operate in a region. And as I mentioned, Alaska would not be the place that it is today without the military investment that occurred during the Second World War. And our military leaders are now finding that engaging with the local populations before implementing their programs really benefits all parties. In my state, we're seeing a renaissance in military activity that we haven't experienced since the end of the Cold War. We're seeing our Coast Guard that is expanding its footprint in the state. We have a construction boom in the interior of the state at our Air Force Base at Eielson as we anticipate additional squadrons of F-35s. We have the Northern Warfare Training Center, which is gaining additional attention for its assets. The military defense agency is working to improve radar coverage across the Pacific, as well as our ground-based missile defense system. The Marine Corps is looking at ADAC as a launching point for amphibious landing exercises. And while these assets are readily expandable to address challenges in the Arctic, our military commanders are finding that their efforts are most efficient when they engage with the local communities and the indigenous populations before they carry out their activities and not afterwards. And we've seen very specific examples of late with Coast Guard exercises in our coastal communities, with Marine Corps engagement with the Native Corporation on ADAC, and with Navy communication with regards to their exercises. We're also looking at infrastructure needed to support any Arctic development, and this is most notably a system of deep water ports that span from the Bering Sea to the Arctic Ocean. Our present reality in Alaska is that the U.S. port nearest to the Arctic is down on the Aleutian chain in Unalaska, nearly 800 miles away. That would be like saying that the nearest port to us here in Shanghai is Hong Kong. I don't think that that would be acceptable here in China, and it shouldn't be acceptable in the United States either. So we're moving forward. I have introduced some legislation that will establish a congressionally chartered Seaway Development Corporation in the Arctic. And this is designed to work with representatives from the U.S. federal agencies of NOAA, the State Department, the Coast Guard, the Department of Transportation, as well as with representatives from the state of Alaska, our business community, our coastal and our subsistence communities, and the maritime labor organizations, seeking to develop services to Arctic shipping that are necessary for safe, secure, and reliable maritime activity. So the goal here is to help attract those investment opportunities for ports and infrastructure development in the Arctic. But again, at the end of the day, to ensure that level of safety, that level of assistance, that level of cooperation with the people of the Arctic. For my goal, my vision for the Arctic is that with every opportunity that we face, with every challenge that we face, the voices of the people of the Arctic are incorporated and are respected at every level. So every conversation that we have should ensure that those voices are heard. You note that I have left off some of the political commentary because I'm certain that in the questions and answer opportunity that I have with President Grimson, we'll have a chance to bring up some of those issues. But I'm pleased to be able to be with you today and to share a view from the U.S. Arctic. Thank you.